and welcome to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. Today we're talking about critique and...
Critique? Did someone say critique? Critique without me? I love critique.
Yeah,
why are you talking about critique without me? God,
just
I love it.
wait a second. Just
so
wait
much.
a minute. We're going to be getting to that.
Hey, can we talk about like other kinds of critique? But
I just like
yeah.
Wait, you guys are talking about critique? Nobody
We're going to be talking about
on.
Oh God! Okay, just play the intro. Play the intro.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams untrue!
Oh yeah, how do we start that? Critique. God, I love it so much.
Critique is so good. Hello and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about giving and getting critique. I am Remy. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomic Kate Blast.
And I am Crispy. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the comic Ghost Junk Sickness.
I am Verathane, or Allie. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomics Chiralt and Witchwood.
And I'm Delphina. I use she, her pronouns, and I make the webcomic Somnambulous.
So as far as tools for creators go, there are very few that are more powerful and useful than a good critique. Although, like any tool, this requires a lot of nuance, patience, and practice.
So, to start things off, we should go into the definition of critique. So, what is it? Reader and peer critique is a fantastic practice that allows us to combine our experiences as readers and as creators to help others with their comics. It can be hard to step back as a creator and experience your story, which you already know intimately inside and out, as if you're a new reader who has no idea where this crazy train might be headed.
Yes. And there's many different types of feedback and critique that creators can use to hone their craft. There's kind of beta readers. You can get solicited or unsolicited critique. And there's also reader reviews. All of these methods have slight differences, but they can each be useful provided the parties involved are all willing and on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Key point right there. Notably, a critique is not the same as a review as a comic. Reviews are tools for readers to let them know if they want to read your story. They can contain information that's useful for the creator, but they have different goals in mind, and if the creator requests the comic to be reviewed, for instance, by a blog or journalist, and is expecting a critique, they may be surprised or even hurt by the results.
So looking at the different kinds of critique, what role does critique play in your own personal working approach when you're making your comic and reworking it and re-editing it and all that jazz?
So critique actually plays a really, really huge role in the work that I do. I do Ghost Junk Sickness with my sister, so there are two of us. So the feedback is constant. I don't do one thing without her input and so forth. But when I want to kind of expand an idea, because at one point your ideas and your minds kind of get melded and you kind of think as one person, you do want an outside perspective, because when you want to reach larger audiences or get something that you don't know is coming across, like Thane said, you can't approach your work as a new reader. So you're really, really biased to everything that you're seeing. So you need that outside perspective to be like, am I getting this right? Is it coming across? And those are really key points for people to enjoy your work, especially as a webcomic that has all of these different facets in it, with the art and the storytelling and the lettering and the pacing and the so on and so forth. That's a lot of things to get right. So I think especially as webcomic creators, critique is your friend. That's a tool that you should learn to use and to understand fully.
Yeah, I use critique a lot in my own working approach. It's something that I didn't start off with when I was starting my first webcomic, which is Chiralt, back in 2007. I was kind of working blind on my own, treating it as kind of a casual thing. But the more my webcomics started taking a role in my life, I started thinking I want to make sure that I'm hitting the goals that I have for the
Mm-hmm.
story. If I have certain emotional beats and I want to make sure that they're going to land the right way for the readers, there's it's really great to get like kind of feedback as you work. With my first comic, I was working so close to my update days that there wasn't really a lot of room for major feedback
Mm.
on the story as I was working on it. But that's one of the things that when I started my second webcomic, I really wanted to change that. So I started working way further ahead in all of my planning stages. I wrote a really big detailed outline and I sent it to several people. I asked them beforehand, like, "Hey, would you be down to look at this? It might be long, and you could give me your thoughts on it, and I'll incorporate those like into my work and just kind of see how the whole structure is reading, if that's working." And I continued that approach the whole way through the story. So I would write a script, and I would start thumbnailing the pages, and I would start sketching the pages in large batches, like a whole chapter at a time. And I was really trying to clean up the work, so that I would be able to send it to beta readers ahead of, like before I started finishing the pages. Because once I've committed something to inks, it gets a little bit harder to edit. And then once I color it, it
Mm.
becomes even harder to edit. And once I start thinking of a page as being done, the types of edits that I'm willing to make will drastically reduce.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of a thing that I started trying to do, is like really tightening up what I was working on. And I have the people that I approach for feedback. There's two different ways in which I do it. I have two very close friends who I we share tastes in a lot of stories, and I've been sharing with them my like master plan outline for the whole story and hashing out like big future like plot events, all the stuff that I consider major spoilers. And then I have other beta readers who I'm trying to keep the information like a little bit less, to mostly just the pages that are actually finished. So the reactions that they'll be able to give me are going to be the closest to what the readers will actually experience once my
Mm.
comic is done and being shown to the public at large. And the it I found it really useful to have that second or third or fourth or 10th pair of eyes on my work. And I don't always make every change that's suggested, because sometimes like what one person thinks might not be the same as what another person thinks, and I've just kind of got to split the difference or find my own solution to something. But it can be a really good way to see where the problem areas could be, and then I know that I've got to, like, oh, the pacing in this part is not really landing. Like these two pages seem really rushed. Maybe they need to be split into a third page, or maybe three pages could be condensed into two, or two pages into one, that sort of thing. And it's been really helpful to be able to get that kind of revision done in my storytelling. I feel like it's made my story a lot tighter.
Yeah, and it's really cool to see the adaptation that you've been able to have of learning from your first comic, and sort of the lead times required to actually have a critique that's actually helpful. Is you can't just toss your work out. Yeah, page goes up in 3 days. Have fun. I've done that, but I think it's like it's being able to adapt to what works long term is so key.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, because that echoes a lot of my experiences too. Um, just starting out, I didn't ask for a lot of critique because I was still working on my stamina. I was still working on being able to do any kind of work on a regular basis from week to week and generating like pages that made some amount of sense. So I didn't have a lot of buffer. I restarted my comic a couple times after I had a few false starts, and but I was just trying to make sure I was confident, and I didn't really reach out until I was ready to publish my first book, because at that point I did have a little bit of distance from the pages that I did, and I really wanted people to buy my book. I wanted
Mhm.
my book to be the best it could be because I'm raising thousands of dollars and I'm printing lots of them and they're going to be in existence for a while. Um, so that's when I kind of put out the formal, hey, here's the 100 pages that I'm going to be looking at, and I've heard a few things from my readers, but I want to hear from my peers, and this was a group of peers in the Spider Forest webcomic collective. Just in terms of what's going on here, what's necessary, what can I streamline and stuff. They had some excellent feedback that I was able to integrate, and I redid a lot of stuff. I like cut about 30 or 40 pages,
Wow.
completely like wrote out some characters, just because I was doing the whole big shonen manga cast right off the bat. I was trying to be Bleach or whatever the and it was
Bleach.
and yeah, it was just not working because people were thinking that certain characters were main characters. Like, no, this is just for this arc. When we get back to the Frieza saga, we're gonna do something else.
The freeze
Uh,
arc, yeah.
no, but it's it was so helpful. I learned a lot, and that draft came out better. I look back on it now; it could be even better, but that's the part of the process, and I really
Yeah, that's
learned to
webcomics.
yeah, and I learned to embrace that like every single other media out there, like TV shows have drafts of scripts, books have drafts of scripts. Why do we as webcomic artists think that we're better than them? Like, yeah, we do need a drafting process. We do need an editing process, and part of that involves critique. Um, so from then on, I've been working on this comic. I bounce ideas off of lots of friends and kind of get some. Yeah, I wish I had the kind of buffer that
Oh, it's dreams, right?
yes, that's kind of the thing that holds me back a lot of times because I'm so close to my release schedule that I don't always have a lot of time. Right now, I'm working with about an 8-page buffer. It's about a scene, and so I do try to get the scene in front of other comic creators in my small groups to say, okay, this is the direction I'm thinking, or I'm thinking this. I'm very wishy-washy, and I will wait to the 11th hour until I make a final decision. But once I do, the drawing goes pretty well. And yeah, that I think for me too, I always thought initially that critique was going to be this this thing where you have to like apply for it, or you have to
Oh,
you
yeah.
have you have to like steel yourself and go, I would like one critique, please. And but
From the
and
critiques vendor.
yeah, it like just very formalized, stiff process. But no, it's like an ongoing thing. It happens a lot in little ways, and it happens very organically once you get that
Yeah.
close group of webcomic creators who know and like your story and want to, invest that time in you. And hopefully you're investing that time in them too.
Absolutely. I know I had a lot of the same sorts of things going on when I was working on my work. And where when I first started Cape Blast, it was very much like, I had a 2-week buffer. That's not enough time to get
No.
anything meaningful out of review. So a lot of times I didn't really seek it out. And it was a lot of me just, trying to just go by the seat of my pants and be like, okay, well, let's make this work. And it wasn't until about this time last year where I started to realize I really needed to wholesale change on my approach. And I just stopped new pages to one, go back and, increase my buffer. But the big important one was I needed a solid critique on my story because it had started creeping up to 26 to 30 chapters. It was becoming this massive behemoth that when I first started making the comic, it was only supposed to be a single issue.
Oh gosh, I
So,
know that.
so it went through exponential growth, and I'm like, I need a second set of eyes. So I sat down and completely rewrote the entire thing and then sat down with a couple of folks and just went through the entire outline of, okay, point by point, does this make sense? Is there any way I can improve this arc? Getting that big top level outline nailed down and critiqued properly before going it back into new pages was so critical to making it so that, like, when I'm drawing the pages, I'm not thinking about that portion. I'm thinking about, okay, this is what it's already written. This is how it's going to go, and having that time to be able to go and look at those, to go back to the big picture, whether it's the big picture of the chapter or the story or parts in between, or even if it's just half a chapter. Because I know for some comics, having a large buffer isn't necessarily tenable, but give yourself enough of a buffer that you can at least get a half chapter to some close friends to be like, does this make sense from an editing standpoint? Because that'll just save you so much time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I feel like when you were talking about like getting feedback on book one right before you went to print, that was kind of the trigger that made me start getting critique. The tipping point from me doing my own thing and forging ahead to me, like, going back and starting to think about my story as something that could potentially be tighter, that could benefit from a few sets of extra eyes. Even if at first I was mostly just thinking, help me catch typos and somebody help me with this pre-press process thing. But the more you look at your old art, the more you notice, like, this could be fixed.
Yeah,
with the
and
benefit.
it's really hard.
Yeah. With 5 extra years of experience, you start to look at these things, and, like, now I am the reader who is experiencing my own story from the outside. I have a little bit more distance between those early pages, and I could kind of go back in and figure out edits. But then, maybe I also want a little help just to make sure that I'm not missing stuff.
Yeah. I think it's, like, really easy to go into those habits that you have and the biases that you also have. The distance helps when you have, like, X amount of years doing critique. But even so, recently we were getting some friends to go through some chapters that we were less enthused with again. And the things that they pulled out, I was just like, I couldn't even see that, but gosh, does that make sense looking at that now? Like, I was so blinded to seeing the points that they were pointing out, but they seem obvious when they do present themselves.
Well, I think too, once you get further into the story, you get a sense of, these are the things that actually mattered in the subsequent plot points, and these things never went anywhere, and if I'm not going to do anything with them, I might as well edit them out. And so that's something that a critique group can really help you identify.
Yes 100% agree.
So when you're trying to get that group together, getting the ball rolling in critique is often the hardest part. As, like, you said, you waited until book one, or I know I waited until halfway through chapter 3. So how do you start that process? How do you solicit and formulate your requests for that kind of a critique?
So I always think that the most important thing to do is to find people who want to see your work above and beyond to get to the point that you want to see it at. That's the key point to critique, is that it has to be
together.
Yes. And being in the webcomics community, we have access to a lot of those things. And I definitely will say that Spider Forest Collective is really, really good for having those tools accessible for people, where they have places that you can submit to ask for critique more openly, and not so much in a group that you know intimately, but it's good for more non or unbiased opinions. But as far as, like, my personal experience is that fostering relationships in the webcomic community, I think, is key to a success in the long-winded road that you're going to have with this, because it's such a long process. And B, you're going to see people who want to see you succeed. And with that, they're going to be able to identify and workshop things that will really help you in the long run. So, I've fostered these relationships with people, And I pick out, a couple people that I knew that had, like Thane said, similar interests. And, you gather a group in something like Discord or some other private messenger. You make some kind of set rules of what you expect and whatnot to hear from each other. And that's when you're going to start presenting the work that you want to improve on. And I think to me, and from what I've had with my experience, is the most successful way I've ever had critique done. I did have critique in college. I took fine arts. So we had one of those more typical, everybody has a painting and you're sitting in a circle and the painting goes on the easel and then there's 5 minutes of silence.
Remember those days.
Oh, they're
Oh, no.
horrible. They were so, like, nobody really cared because you weren't in a relationship with people wanting to see your work expand. So, like, they can be used for good when they're curated and have set rules, but like
Yes.
that's something that that's something that is hard to kind of establish, where people don't really know that you need to set some ground rules before starting, because they can become very unfulfilling, I will say.
Yeah, I know one of the groups that I'm a reasonably large part of is the Boston Comics Roundtable, which used to hold in-person meetings, which hopefully they will soon again in the future once the world gets back in order. But one of the things that they used to do that was really great was the first Thursday of every month was a writer's night, where you came in an hour and a half before the regular meeting and you sat in a group of other comics writers who had read your script and taken copious notes. And there was a very structured environment for that. There were lots
Yeah.
of rules set up. So what kind the kinds of critique of, I think they're cool. That's nice feedback, but like that's not good critique in a setting like that. So they're having those rules set up of, okay, this is exactly the sort of things that are looking for. And actually, when you submitted your script for that night, it was, here's your script, here's the background information, what are you looking for?
Mhm.
And that was all in the summary.
Mhm.
And I think that sort of structured environment is really needed when you want good crit. You got to be very clear with what you're giving and what you want.
Yeah, and I remember like the old times DeviantArt, it still does it, but they had a whole little system for artists where they could have their piece that they submitted to the site have critique enabled, and it would give you this nice little structured format where you'd have to critique on certain parts of it, and do so in a way that actually wants to see the piece go above and beyond. So obviously, when you say, hey, I want critique from this piece, that means that you still want to work on it and you still want to improve and stuff like that. So it's always going to be helpful when you curate the space to let the critiquer know that you're going to be valuing their time as well. I think that's a big point with this, is always the giving and the getting kind of thing with that whole premise.
Well, I definitely agree that it's really important, first off, to find the right audience, so to speak, or the right target to request critique from. If you're making a very unsettling horror comic and you approach somebody who only likes really fluffy stuff, they might not have the best. They might not even enjoy reading it.
Oh, you might be surprised.
You never know. This is where asking and communication comes into play.
Yes.
A good place to start, if you're just starting out and you don't have a circle of peers or friends or like trusted confidants yet, or community spaces like Spider Forest, which has a constructive critique forum. And there's actually a really detailed list of like guidelines that you go through. You basically, it's not exactly a form, but there's like a set of like questions that you answer as you're requesting critique from the community, which can be really helpful, because this ties into what I want to say about this subject, which is like formulating the request itself. There's definitely things that you can do that will help you get a better result from your critique request. And the first thing that I always do when I want critique from someone, assuming they've already agreed to like give critique and I know they're open to that sort of thing, I always try to ask very direct questions about what it is that I want to hear about. Like if I have like a scene and I don't know how the pacing is going, I will ask them right out, what do you think of the pacing in this scene? Very, very direct. And I always find that gets much more targeted feedback on the thing that you want to find out about. The more vague you are with your request, the harder it is on the person who's trying to give you feedback, because now they're just kind of scouring it and trying to like guess at like, what should I say about this? I guess the art's pretty good, but it looks, oh, there's a typo there. It looks like the line on the nose in that panel is a bit unclear, and that might not be the kind of critique that you want. So you have to make sure that you're specific with the person that you're requesting it from about your expectations. And the second thing is to make sure that the person you're requesting crit from has all the context that they need. If you send them a page of thumbnails or a scene that's unfinished, maybe also give them like a text description of what is supposed to be happening, so that as they're looking at it, they know what your goal is in your own words. And even if it's finished pages, it can still be helpful sometimes to give them a description of the scene as you see it, so that they can look at the pages you've drawn and the description and see where they're not quite matching up. And be like, oh, it says here that you want this character to be upset, but their expression isn't reading properly, or the angle that you've chosen isn't as dramatic for the beat that's supposed to be a big deal. So maybe you can move these panels around and kind of make this scene read a little closer to what your actual vision is. And this is where also it's important for you to know what it is that you want out of the scene. So like sit down and think a bit about like your story and the place that this stuff plays in it, and make sure you kind of work that in to the request that you're submitting to somebody.
That context is so important. Yeah, because you can't just come in and say, "What do you think of my comic?" Right? Like you just it's never going to work out, because someone's going to say, "Well, I think their shoes are weird." And it's just like I was never even considering changing what kind of shoes they were wearing, but thanks.
Yeah.
I guess.
Those vague requests drive me crazy.
Oh gosh, yeah. There's nothing more aggravating, I guess, as someone who, is set up for giving a critique, and someone's just like, "Can you critique my stuff?" And you're like, "Okay," and then that's as far as it gets. And you're like, "I need a place to start. I need to know where I'm going, because I'm gonna critique random shoes, I guess, at this point. I don't know what you want me to focus on." Especially with a webcomic, there's a lot. There's so much there. There could be critiques on anything. So if you need to give the critiquer like a springboard to kind of go from, and a goal for both of you to kind of reach for that to be effective.
Yes. And that's why I like the having that, like Thane said, as well, is having that structure in the approach of critique person. This is exactly what I'm looking for. You got to be specific, or else you're not going to get everything out of it that you want.
I usually write a whole list of questions if I have something that I really wonder about. I'll have like 2 or 3. I'll try to get specific about it, and then maybe like follow it up with like is there anything else that jumps out to you as you were reading? I found that phrasing tends to work pretty well. Otherwise, you like if you get too vague about it, you might end up with people like you post a link to your comic in there and you're like, "What do you think of my comic?" And then everybody will just start critiquing your website because they're not sure what to say.
Yeah.
Your drop-down menu is a little weird. And,
The colors are hard to see through. Wait.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I think one of the things for me too is one of the things that I ask somebody if they come to me asking for critique is, what other works are your inspiration? What do you consider in the same family? Because if they're making some kind of, magical fantasy thing, and like, okay, I know a lot of magical fantasy things. Is this Lord of the Rings? Is this, more like a Disney sort of thing? Like, how serious am I supposed to be taking this? Because then you can also look at what those other things have done to solve the problems that this person is having. And it can be a less personal way to address, like, hey, your pacing is a little um but here's another like work that had you could try doing some of the things that this author did, and that way you're kind of both coming from a place of, you like Full Metal Alchemist, I like Full Metal Alchemist, let's look at what Full Metal Alchemist does and
Mm-hmm.
look at some examples.
Yeah, that's like probably one of like the best ways to kind of like utilize like that common ground that you have, so that the specificity of like what you're looking for in the critique is just easily met when you're just like, I am clearly inspired by XYZ. I really liked how they did it in this content. I want to get there. I want to get to the point where I want my impact to be that. How do I get there? Like a commission that you get or that you want from an artist, the more specific that you are, the better the end results will be.
Yeah, and I don't think this is something that you have to formulate into like the perfect essay that you have to,
No.
post in the forum like immediately. This work is inspired by blah 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 blah. Like, you don't have to do that, because it should be a conversation. It should be
Yeah.
like a back and forth, very comfortable. If you're not comfortable with the person you're asking for critique from, it's probably not going to be very effective. So,
Yes.
just talk to them about, what you like, what you're going for, and trust that they're coming to you in good faith, and, they're in this space with you because they want to be helpful.
Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely a collaborative workshop environment. You get everyone. It's a give and take on both sides, and you got to be willing to sort of hear what they have to say, but also be willing to, if you're giving critique, be ready for the person to maybe not necessarily listen to what you're saying, or be ready to, like, well, I didn't really like this solution. However, we can do it this way and it'll get the same job done. And having that back and forth in a conversational format is so critical to having, a solid result, rather than just an essay of here's what I liked, here's what I didn't. That's, where those serve its purpose, but I don't think it's, min-maxing the results of your critique.
Yeah, this reminds me of an infographic that was made by Mary Robinette Kowal for the Writing Excuses podcast, about the kind of nature of critique and using the metaphor of like a clinical trial in medicine, where you break down the critique into symptoms, diagnosis, and prescription. And the symptoms are, like, from the reader's perspective, the feelings that they experience as they're going through the story. Like, how are the beats landing? Do they feel excited? Do they feel confused? And those can be genuine from absolutely anybody, so long as you're recognizing that that's all that they are. It's like, these are the reactions that they experience as they take in the story. And this is why even like comments on your comic as it's going through are a type of feedback.
Yes.
And they can be really handy if like 50 people are all saying the same thing, like, oh, I'm very confused by this. That might be something that you need to look at. They're not telling you why necessarily, but they're sharing a genuine reaction to your work, provided you do feel it's genuine, because of course there are trolls out there. Every situation is going to be a little bit subjective, but those symptoms are kind of what like reader reviews will kind of be formulated from. It's just the experience of reading it from a complete outsider's perspective, not even necessarily a creator, and it can be useful, but it's when you go a step further into trying to analyze, like, why are these feelings happening this way, that's where you get into the diagnosis category, and that's a little bit more, you want to have somebody you trust offering that level of analysis on your work, because they, like, not everybody's necessarily going to know where you're coming from, like that horror story versus a super fluffy author analogy. Like, they'll have different approaches to their work. They value different things in different types of storytelling. And yeah, ideally it should be somebody who has a close idea of what you're doing before they start offering the diagnosis or the prescription, trying to fix things and change stuff.
So how do you know when you should ask for this critique? Because that's the biggest step in starting. Or how shouldn't you?
How shouldn't you ask for
How
critique?
should you or shouldn't you?
I mean, I wouldn't put a random just, hey, someone critique my comic in public. I think it's just, you're gonna get too many too many opinions, and it's gonna be very overwhelming, or none at all, because it's also very confusing as to what you want because it sounds vague. Again, I definitely would try to approach your people that you have, your contacts, your community, and kind of go from there. But definitely, as a rule, not to ask for critique. I wouldn't do it so openly and vague. And also, don't ask critique if you don't want to change anything. Too, critique is a tool to improve your craft and to get to the next level that you want to be. And it's not necessarily a tool for praise, which some people sometimes conflate the two. Critique is not there just to tell you that you're doing a good job. It's definitely a deconstruction process, and it's people's time too.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely tempting to look at things where, and it's perfectly valid to go and be like, look, I'm not really interested in redraws right now, but how do I improve things moving forward? That's totally valid, especially in webcomics where things take so long, where people have, other obligations outside of comics. But, if with critique, there is that give and take where you got to be willing to give something.
Yeah, and especially like, say if you do get critique, or you want critique, but you're not necessarily up for the change in the pages that you do have released, just state that you want to use the information that you've got from the experience for your later projects, or later pages and stuff like that. I just think it's really respectful to let the person who's giving you critique know that their time is valued, because it does take a lot of time.
Yeah, that respect thing is so important, because I've been in situations where I've read so many pages of this person's comic. I have so many ideas and so many thoughts, and then I put them out there and they're like, "Oh, okay." And I just feel very ignored. Like,
Oh
did you
my
even
goodness.
read any of that?
Yes.
So yeah, you do need to come in with a respectful and courteous attitude, and really seriously consider the feedback that you receive in good faith. Because if you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to get a variety of hopefully very kindly and politely worded viewpoints, and just kind of sit through it and sit with it, then I don't think you're ready to get that kind of critique.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. When I give critique, it does take me a while to really think about things. So
Gotta be in the zone.
Yeah, I feel like there's also been cases that anyone who's been on the internet long enough in creative spaces has seen those times when people will request critique when really what they just want is to hear compliments about their work, and then shut down when there's any kind of serious analysis that's applied to it.
I totally agree that that respect part plays such a huge role of respecting both the time of the people that are giving you their critiques, but also respecting sort of that, you're asking other peers, you're asking colleagues, ideally, or people who at least understand comics enough to be able to provide actual critique that helps you as a creator. And being able to be respectful both ways on that creative process part of it, of, if you're giving crit, you're going to look at someone's work and someone's work process. And I think looking at the process is just as important as looking at the story. And you're not going to suggest something to someone who works 2 30-hour-a-week jobs. That's not going to work for them or something. You're going to have to okay, understand that certain things just aren't going to happen.
That's a really important
Yeah.
point, because I think there's so many like Marvel or DC or whatever, they've got like teams of people doing things, and
Yes.
we're only one person.
Or even
usually.
Webtoons originals, a lot of them
Two.
have teams.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people aren't working with that. So knowing like who you're talking to, a lot of times people come in and they're like, "I'm the writer, not the artist. Can you give me critique?" And like, so you need to not give them the art critique, because
Hmm.
that doesn't really work. So for sure, knowing like what part of the process you're talking to, and like what, yeah, what they're gonna be doing in the comic is words. Yeah.
Just as I found my train again.
Yeah.
I think it's important when you're going into a space to request critique to have been honest with yourself about what your own goals are. Because if your comic is being made purely for very personal therapy or
Yes.
catharsis, and you don't actually want to change it, and the content is so personal that like you don't want to hear things about it, it can be a little unfair to go into a space and request critique. Or, like, similarly, if you're just really having an absolute blast working on it and doing whatever you want, and you don't want to try to conform it to what other people think represents good storytelling or good craft or whatever, then similarly, you don't need to get critique. Like, if you are
Yeah.
digging your process, you're getting what you want out of it, then you don't need critique. Whereas on the other hand, if you have a specific goal that you don't think you're meeting, that critique can help you meet, like you, for instance, you want to get more readers, or the reactions that your current readers are giving you are not in line with what your goals are for the scene, you can request critique to try to bring those more in line with one another. Or if you're going to print, or if you want to submit your comic as a pitch to a publisher or something like that, like then getting outside feedback can be super helpful. But you've got to be aware of what your work represents to you, what you want to do with it, and why you're requesting critique from someone else.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I absolutely agree. And I just think that there's no shame in not wanting critique. There's no shaming like coming home from your, 40-hour a week job and just wanting to like do a nice vent comic or something like that. And
Right?
just because you're posting it publicly doesn't mean that you are committing to making this, very streamlined thing. I mean, we're all doing this as our passion projects. And like maybe if you were being paid money for this sort of thing, you would need to seek out critique whether you wanted to or not. But if you're not in that position, you don't have to put yourself in that position. You can just do it for the fun of it, and there's no shame in that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's like a key part is so many people in webcomics, like as much as it's the dream for a lot of people, a lot of people, work multiple jobs or have something that's going on other than webcomics as their primary sort of breadwinner. In order to set yourself up for a solid critique, you gotta know sort of what you need and what you're looking for out of your whole comic creative process.
Hmm.
Um, and because if you don't know what you want out of the thing that you're making, you're not going to be able to get as much as you can out of critique.
Yeah. Yeah. I think goals are like probably like the best thing to think about when going into any of this. And I think that's probably why it takes us so long to kind of initiate asking for critique, like y'all talking about going into your first book before you ask for critique, and or like furthering your chapters and stuff like that. um, Goals, they're kind of hard to obtain in the beginning, I think, sometimes, especially with how long-winded comics are, web comics are. But I think as you go further along, you're like, okay, I understand where I want to go, and now I need help to get there. And there's no shame in that. Oh my goodness. Honestly, critiques, again, they're an amazing tool and they're very useful. And I think that there's something that should be embraced by all creators, to get that feedback to become like, the best that you can be with your work that you have.
Yeah, and with that in mind, I know like the whole creative process and the whole critique process is a very personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
Can get very raw at times. How do you all process that critique and be able in ways that you can actually implement in a healthy way?
So, like, first of all, when kind of getting a critique, I think even before anything happens, you have to prep yourself for. I mean, I usually say the worst, but it's not like a horrible thing that happens. I just phrase it that way. But you're going to prep yourself for some deconstructing of your work that is very intimate to you, and that's gonna affect you either really strongly or emotionally, regardless of what is being said. So always have like a good kind of mind space headspace when you get into it, because it actually can be very draining to give slash receive critiques. So kind of prepare yourself, have a good day where you can read this stuff over and know that you're looking at it very objectively and can understand what's, being said to you, or, when you give critique, the same applies. But I think, preparing yourself for that kind of emotional investment, I'm going to call it, I think is key to kind of wrap your head around the whole experience.
Yeah, I think being in a good emotional space to process it is pretty important. I always try to reply to the feedback that I get right away to make sure that the person who gave it to me knows that I appreciate it, even if I haven't fully read it through immediately. And then when I'm in a good headspace to really sit down and start working on the story, I'll sit down, I'll have all my notes together, I'll write out even more notes about what it is that I'm doing with this scene. I'll read through all the feedback that I have about that chunk kind of all at once. And once I start, one of the things that this goes a little bit more into kind of story crafting and could be a different episode entirely, but I try to think about the type of scene, like what my goal is in the part of the story that I'm working on, because there's different purposes for different scenes, even within the same story. Some you really want to focus on exposition, some you want to focus on plot development, and some you want to focus on character development. And they'll usually just be kind of one dominant thing that it's doing, even if there's a little bit of all three in there. And I'll try to nail down what it is that I want it to be focusing on, and draft out my plans kind of around that. And once I have a first round of new sketches, I'll usually, if it's still an option to me, I'll send them back to the person who gave me the crit to be like, is this looking good? Do you feel like this addresses some of what was potentially an issue? Has this made it better? Any other changes? Yeah, that's kind of my process for it.
Yeah, I think too, like, just kind of, you can get a lot of critique, and you might hear, like, if you post on a forum or something like that, you might hear from different people all at the same time. So giving yourself to a chance to, like, read through it all, see where, like, the overlap is that multiple people are seeing, like, issues or problems, and kind of going from there is sort of what I look to do. Sometimes I also have a gut feeling about, like, I know I'm going to have to change something in this scene. This is the scene that I'm looking for, and they're sort of confirming what I'm fearing here. So let's take a look at their suggestions and kind of turn them over in my head and see, okay, yeah, maybe that would work. What would that affect for my future plans? So sometimes I'll revise my past pages. I think we web comics. I have this opinion that webcomics are so unlike any other media in that if you want to make a change to your past pages, you can do it. You can change the art, you can change the words, you can change entire chapters. Like I said, I've cut out like lots of different things from my comics and just completely rewritten them and reposted them. And I think a lot of us hesitate to do that because we think, oh no, they're going to like the old version better and blah 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 blah. And honestly, in my experience, that has never happened. There's
Yep.
never been anybody who said, gosh, I really, really loved that character that you cut out that meant nothing to the story later on.
Funny
Like,
enough, I had that once. But I liked the new
no.
stuff so much more that I was like, okay. I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you, but
I've never been called out on my revisions. I've like re-uploaded like something like 30 or 40 pages in Witchwood just within the like 2 years that this comic has been running. And
People
I
don't
just
even
kind of do it on the
remember.
fly.
No.
Yeah,
They
People
they'll
don't.
get it when they reread.
yeah, for me it was when I retconned my entire prologue. Someone noticed. It was like, oh, I'm gonna miss these characters that were here, and that this was some interesting lore. And I'm like, don't worry, I like the new lore better. So just I'm sorry, don't know what to tell you.
trust me. Just trust me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think like one of the things that I picked up from what you all have been saying here too is that like the headspace before, during, and after is so critical. And I know for me, one of the things that I like to do when I'm getting a crit session, and I know it's going to be any crit session, big or small, is going to have some kind of emotional impact. At least for me, it does. So having those support things in place of, okay, I know where I'm getting this critique, but I'm not going to do anything about it until I get a good night's sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Or like I'm gonna go have like a fun activity afterwards, or have something set up for yourself so that you're in a good spot. I think a lot of those feelings and emotions can get a lot like not as severe if it's with someone that you trust a lot and
Hmm.
that you have a good working relationship with, because then you can come out of those feeling supercharged and feeling
Mm-hmm.
ready to like, yes, I'm feeling great about this. Let's do this.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the best. You got to prepare for it to hit hard, but I think part of setting yourself up for success and that self care is picking people who you're getting your crit from, who you know are going to be helpful and understanding.
Mm-hmm.
It really does feel so good when you land on a revision that works. Like sometimes it'll just click. And I mean, it's nice if when you're writing it the first time, it all just clicks, but sometimes it takes until the second or third draft of a scene
And
before
when
you
that Rubik's
really
Cube clicks
land.
together, it's
It's so good.
Choirs from heaven.
Yes.
yes.
But I do like that the fact that here we be talking about webcomics are, and the fact that it's like it's very versatile and it's very unique in that it's transformative. I'm going to be saying that a lot. Sorry everybody. But you do have the power to change things if you are unhappy with them, and revise things that you do get critique on that you want to be stronger. And I think it's just, again, like, I would embrace critiques. It's a really, really good tool, and you come out stronger in the end after the successful sessions, I will say, from those guys.
So, talking about setting yourself up for success, what's something that you would say does not set yourself up for success?
Well, to your point, it's just setting up that group that you trust and knows your work and knows you. I think because we post our work online and because we have all of this feedback, maybe we have a comment section, maybe we have a Discord server or whatever, we get all kinds of comments from readers and stuff. And I really feel like there's a parasocial element to that
Mm-hmm.
because these readers are getting to know and love your work, your world, your story, sometimes even feeling a sense of ownership of exactly what characters they like or where the story is going. And that might not be in complete alignment with what you want for the story. So yeah, just be careful with that because comment sections are great. I love my comment section. I love hearing from them. Um, but a lot of times they're kind of projecting a relationship with
Yes.
you that you don't necessarily have with them. You don't know who they are
Yeah.
and exactly how they're interpreting your story and if it's where you want it to to end up. So just having a private space away from the Twitter or the comment section or whatever you've got, to really identify you and you. These
Yeah.
are the people I trust. Like
Yeah.
that's so important.
Yeah, and I think that it can become really easily overwhelming when you hear like a bunch of different opinions too. When you do open it so publicly, like Delphi said on Twitter, or even a super public Discord too. Like I 100% say those private spaces are the best place to have a curated and efficient place to critique, because I feel like, along with the emotional impact that can come with receiving a critique, it's gonna be 10 times more ineffective and kind of worse receiving it from a bunch of like a huge group of people, and you don't even know where to pick and choose from like the actual quality kind of feedback that you receive too. People need to know your goals, and I think that also requires them understanding and knowing you to a certain level.
Absolutely.
I definitely think that we could go on with this for 30,000 hours, but
Oh, God,
unfortunately,
So
We
what
gotta
about
come
a
back to
part
this.
2?
Yeah.
we do.
Oh
we
my
do.
God, we need a part 2.
So this has been Screen Tones. I have been your host, Rennie. You can find my work at kateblast.com. Where can we find y'all's work?
I am Crispy. You can find me at ghostjunksickness.com.
I am Verathane. You can find my work at geralt.sevensmith.net or witchwoodcomic.com.
And I'm Delphina, and you can find my webcomic Sombulus at sombulus.com.
So what are your thoughts on unsolicited critique?
Oh, fuck you.
Thank you so much for listening to Screen Tones. Please subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to also follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast.